Great.
Welcome to the National Press Club. And Ralph, welcome to Washington, D.C. My name is Carrie Douglas, and I'm the founder of Nine Muses International, which is a business that supports the arts and sciences, gain a larger audience and platform with relevant leaders, and just create a positive dialogue and better partnerships. And so as a member of the National Press Club, it's really an honor to welcome you here tonight for this really important topic. And in addition to the topic, we have three fabulous investigative reporters who are with us, two live and one over the phone line. So let me just explain a little bit about the Press Club for those who are new to the Press Club. The Press Club is over 100 years old, and it's been dedicated to basically journalism and communications professionals. And the goal is to bring as many newsmakers as possible to the Press Club. And so that we do have tonight. A few rules before we start. If you do have a cell phone, if you could just turn off the ringer. But if you do Twitter and you do tweet, for those here who do hashtag Chasing Aphrodite with an E. If you want to follow this story beyond tonight, follow Jason Felch at Chasing Aphrodite without the E. So just know the little difference here tonight. In addition, it is going to be a tight program. As you can see, the room is packed. We have a number of people who have a lot of really good questions. So during Q&A, when we start, please state your name, your affiliation, and then make your question as brief as possible, and no statements, please. Books are on sale in the lobby right now, and they'll be on sale after the program. And Jason will sign books over on this table, over on the side of the room here. So if you haven't purchased your book yet, now would be a good time to just sort of sneak out and go get it. If not, after the program, they'll be available for sale. So let's start the program. First things first, it is on the record. So just take note of that. And since it is the State of the Union tonight, it is a pleasure to really raise the awareness of looted art and the state of basically civil society with investigative journalists creating an information platform so that you know better what's happening in our museums and what is happening in our public dollars. So I'm pleased to introduce our speaking team tonight. In addition to fantastic investigative reporters who were up for the 2006 Pulitzer Prize, one won and two were finalists, but we'll come to how that breaks down. We also have visionaries who are true leaders in the art world, from the idea of collections and the idea of museum, and how do you present this collection for the public, and what is the best way to do it, and what is the future of antiquities in our museums. So for tonight, I'd like to introduce Jason Felch, who is an author. He is the author of Chasing Aphrodite with Ralph Frammolino, who is on the phone right now. But Jason is an award-winning journalist from the Los Angeles Times. He's covered money laundering, drug trafficking, and public education and corruption. And he, too, was up for a number of awards. Ralph Frammolino, who is on the phone. Ralph, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Ralph is the co-author of Chasing Aphrodite, and he too was up for the Pulitzer Prize in 2006, and he's been a newspaper reporter for the last 30 years. He's now in South Asia teaching journalism and investigative reporting techniques in particular, and the right to information laws. So we're really thankful Ralph could join us tonight. My co-moderator, I'm like, well, how do I describe him? My co-moderator for this evening is James Grimaldi. And James Grimaldi, for those of you local to DC, is an investigative reporter with the Washington Post and has done some fantastic exposure of the Smithsonian and a number of great pieces. He just covered the Marion Gingrich story in the paper, so he covers a little bit of politics and a little bit of corruption. And they might intersect as well. And then next we have Arthur Houghton, who was a curator over at the Getty Museum, and he was an instrumental source for the book. And in addition, Arthur was a Foreign Service officer and traveled the world for us through this Department of State. But Arthur is also an author of a number of books on art, antiquities, coins, you name it. Arthur is an expert on this area. And then next we have Gary Vikan, and I'm really pleased that he's here tonight because the Baltimore Sun, for those of you who do get the Baltimore Sun, just featured Gary as one of the visionaries in the arts world for 2012. And so we're very lucky that he's here. He's the director of the Walters Art Museum, and if you haven't been, make the trip. It's a fantastic museum. What's also really interesting about Gary is he's really brought forward the intersection of the arts and the brain and how the two intersect. In addition, I also learned that he helped set up a training school in Iraq with Iraqi curators. So the idea of how do we translate our know-how to those who might need just a little bit of extra help. And so with that, the tale tonight is as old as art itself. And the question that I pose is our obsession to possess art above the law? And so with that, I will pass it to James, and we'll start the program and then go to Q&A. Thanks for being here.
Thank you, Carrie. I just want to thank Carrie very much for putting this together and thank the National Press Club, our host for this event. I was shocked to learn today that Carrie is not on the board of the National Press Club, because ordinarily this is something that would be done by a press club board member because of all the time that it takes to devote to it. She's put an enormous amount of work into this, and we want to thank her. So I have a few of my own ground rules, which are in addition to Carrie's. One is, please explain your terms. Two, no acronyms without telling us what they stand for. And we'll have lots of time for questions. I've talked to some of you. I wandered around the crowd a bit. Very impressed. We have a very, very intelligent crowd. We have people from art museums, members of the press club, students, and otherwise. I think we're going to have some excellent questions. It's all on the record, so anything you say could be taken down. I think there might even be a couple of journalists in the audience. So I thought we would start with the book. We'll start with Jason. And Jason, in 2004 and in 2005, he was writing about burying units and his extravagant spending at the Getty. We're familiar with a little bit of that because we had some of that. Some of you may know if you read my stories in the Washington Post with Larry Small and some others at the Smithsonian Institution. And the same thing that sort of happened, I think, with me happened with Jason. For me, the way I got on the Smithsonian story was I'd written about the National Zoo and their deaths, and the Smithsonian runs the zoo. And I began getting these phone calls and these emails. And I think maybe that happened to you. Is that right, Jason?
That is right. In 2004 and 2005 was writing about tax issues at the Getty. They're basically their misuse of their tax-exempt status. And after a year of wailing away on this topic and writing a series of stories, one of the people who worked at the Getty, who I had gotten to know, pulled me aside and said, you know, this isn't the big story. The big story is in the Antiquities Department, and you should look into that. And well, that got me very curious. The tax code is interesting, but not quite as interesting as Looted Antiquities. And so that got me going. I quickly teamed up with Ralph, and we started digging into a whole new area of the Getty, something that had been going on at the museum really for decades. And what we found, in essence, was that the J. Paul Getty Museum, like museums across the United States, had been knowingly buying recently looted antiquities, dug up from tombs and ruins across, in the Getty's case, across the Mediterranean, smuggled out of those countries, laundered through a criminal network based largely in Europe, and put on display at the Getty or at a museum near you. This came to light largely through thousands of pages of internal Getty documents, which were leaked to us by multiple sources who were very upset with what had been going on at the Getty and the way that the Getty had been handling this crisis internally. And if there's one thing that investigative reporters love, it is disgruntled people who are not being listened to by their managers. So if any of you are managers out there...
and with documents.
Right, and particularly those who take documents with them, yes. So that's what we found. There was no one deep throat in this case. As we like to say, Ralph and I have said this often, because we're always asked about the sourcing, we had a Greek chorus of deep throats. That was how upset people were with what had been going on at the Getty. And just as we were in the very early stages of digging into this, the story kind of started running ahead of us. Marion True, the longtime antiquities curator at the Getty Museum, was indicted by Italy on April Fool's Day of 2005. And that really got the ball rolling, because this was the first time that an American curator had ever been indicted by a foreign country. And it got everyone's attention in the art world. Well, we happened to be in a position at that time to know what had been going on in the Getty for the last 30 or 40 years and how this had come to pass. That's the story that we tell in Chasing Aphrodite. And as you'll hear Gary and Arthur talk about later this evening, and Ralph certainly too, it's a controversy that I think changed the way people think about American museums, much like the steroid scandal changed the way people think of Major League Baseball, and the Catholic Church scandal changed the way people think about the church. I think this controversy really did, in the public mind, make people think twice about their local museum and where these wonderful pieces of art had come from.
So I'd like to turn now to Ralph. This being at the National Press Club and having journalists in the audience, I'd like to know a little bit, and Ralph won't be surprised at this at all, about technique. Ralph and I have been, and Jason as well, longtime members of a group called Investigative Reporters and Editors, and we often talk about how we do our investigation. This one must have posed some original problems. I'm wondering, Ralph, what you did, what your first thoughts were, what your questions were, what your approach was to the material, how you organized with Jason this investigation.
Oh, thanks, James, and hello, everybody. I'm calling you from Dhaka, Bangladesh. And James, you mentioned the IRE. We just finished a 3-day training here with about 30 journalists on how to use spreadsheets to analyze budgets. So investigative reporting is really quite at the core of journalism, and American journalism especially. And we learn these techniques as you become more, you go through your career, you do learn these techniques. But this is a special story, at least for me, because I love going to museums, but I don't know anything about art. And actually that gave me an advantage. I didn't have sources that I would alienate. I didn't have sort of my own specialties or my own likes or dislikes. I was in awe of art, but I also saw it as something that was an object. I mean, if you look at a statue, it's beautiful, but it is also an object, and under the law, it is something that someone can possess, and so there's a person who has the right to possess it and a person who doesn't. And so for me, the most daunting challenge was to become as much of an expert on antiquities and on the laws of antiquities as I could, and that was a steep curve. And Jason, I think, had a little bit of a head start on that. And so it was a very confusing world, and at times, to outsiders, the art world can be a hostile world because these are people who are extremely well educated and who speak a special language. And outsiders, especially investigative reporters, are not welcome unless there is something attached to it that would be praiseworthy or you would get good PR. We were looking at the dark underbelly of this world. So learning the terms, becoming the expert, and then we had just an amazing amount of documentation. So trying to figure out the internal processes of the Getty, what exactly was an acquisition, how was it done, what are the numbers, all the nuts and bolts that an investigative reporter must master so that when you talk to somebody who does this for a living, who lives and breathes this, you can talk and be on the same page. That was pretty daunting. And then we had to learn about the Italian justice system, such as it is, and and how to find documents there, because we went to Italy, what certain procedures were, how, for instance, in the Italian justice system, and this will be part of the story eventually, instead of having a trial that lasts 10 days, they have a 10-day trial that's 1 day a month. So you won't put all the 10 days together. You have 1 day in January, 1 day in February, 1 day in March. Well, it just so happens that on February, that's when you have a strike. The lawyers decide to go on strike, so that throws everything up in the air. So this to me was the most daunting part of it. Once you get past that, then it's like other investigative stories. You look for patterns. You look for patterns of behavior. You find what's on the record and what is stated as a statement of truth or fact, and you try to verify that and authenticate it, and you find out, well, maybe it's the other way around, or maybe they're not telling the whole truth.
Thank you for that. So the laws, he said, the rules for the antiquities were daunting and a steep curve, but luckily we have Gary here tonight who can explain it in 2 minutes or less, or to the best of your ability. Explain to us, what are the ground rules? I mean, there must be ethical norms, there must be some laws involved. There's, I understand, an acronym known as the UNESCO that has its own convention from 1970. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think the UNESCO Convention of 1970 on cultural property was the beginning of a change, a process that we're still going through and is yet unresolved. But its key elements are kind of twofold, I guess, as I take it away. One is to call upon source countries, places that are rich in art, to do their best to take care of the art they have in terms of just preserving it in the ground and having archaeological systems in place. But the other is to acknowledge, on the other side of the equation, art-poor countries, but cash-rich countries, those destinations to which the art has traditionally gone, the United States being certainly high among them, that they bore an obligation to that same principle. And the obligation is platformed on two things, that this art is inherently valuable, as oil is valuable or minerals are valuable. But more than that, that the art of a country or a region or a people is a defining element in who they are. And so this was 1970. And realize that the ethical guidelines for museums in acquiring art for 30 years thereafter, in fact, more than 30 years thereafter, said essentially this, that museums should not knowingly acquire works of art that have been exported from the country of origin illegally. So you just juxtapose those two things, and you realize there's something immensely unresolved. And in a way, that framework in which the story of the Getty is played out is the story, and trying to reconcile those two, which are not, at this point, reconciled. Granted, the museum community has gone through 2 iterations of policy changes, one of which, the most recent of which, from 2008, acknowledges 1970 as the point from which you should have a paper trail before you acquire works of art. But as anybody who's in this business knows, we're not there yet, and there are vast numbers, and I mean tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of works of art, 10,000s of which are within 50 miles of this spot, that are sitting in living rooms. And they shouldn't be sitting in living rooms forever. We've got to figure that out.
So the standard is, since 70, not knowingly accepting something that was stolen, is that right? So we need to get to where we are with Jason and Ralph's book. We turn to Arthur. And Arthur, how long did you work at the Getty?
4 years.
4 years. So I guess you're going to be our Getty representative, and we'll have fun with that. And I have a question for you, a question that everyone in this audience probably will know, which is, what did the Getty know, and when did they know it?
Well, let me start at the beginning. I was not among the chorus of deep throats that I think helped Jason and Ralph. I came separately to the idea that I should be of help to both of them when they were developing the story went into the Los Angeles Times and then flowed into the book that you have before you. I was at the Getty for 4 years between 1982 and 1986, and to describe the rules of the game as they were played then and across the country in the 20th or 30 or so collecting museums in this country, the first question is, what was your obligation to the museum as a collecting museum? When I went abroad and dealt with a large number of people who sold or who trafficked in antiquities, there are a series of questions you had to ask yourself at the time. The first one was, first of all, obviously, is what I'm looking at real? There are lots of forgeries out there, but that's only the first question. The second question, is it of museum quality? Is it something that would serve the public benefit by being in our museum and therefore explained and published and exhibited and preserved? We did an enormous job of preservation for everything we took in. The third question was it viable? Was there any legal attachments to it? Was there an issue that might compromise, for example, the title to it? And the third, of course, was the price worth the effort to pay attention to it or even go into a discussion? There are other aspects of it, that those came up first of all. The rules at the time were, if it met all those criteria, it was something that we could propose to the museum's trustees to buy. And we could do it in clear conscience because we believed all of us believed we were serving the public interest in doing so. Moreover, it was legal. There was no legal sanction or question about whether we should or should not be buying something on the international market. It might have been out of a country of origin. It might have belonged to a private collection for years. It was not knowable, and the dealers whom I met with were very clear that they would not let me know what the background to it was, which is not a way of concealing a dubious origin, but concealing all origins. Any of you who know or have met antiquities dealers, art dealers in general, they have a good reason to be quiet about what they do. That's very simple. So we bought, and we bought in volume. And we bought from dealers, and we bought from private collectors. Every now and then, something would turn up. Oh my God, there's a problem here, always after the fact. That is, there is a famous instance called the Smoking Gun Memorandum, which I was part of, and I can say I regret having written today, that established the fact that I realized at some point that something that we had bought out of an American collection, had been in the United States for a considerable period, was in fact right out of the ground in an area in southern Italy. And I frankly tell you, I did not know what to do with that information. It was crystal clear what was happening, but I was in receipt of knowledge about an object that was stolen. And so I pushed it forward, upward, into the museum's directorate. That's what I did. Should I have screamed and yelled, there is a problem with it? Perhaps louder than I did.
So let's turn to Ralph. Ralph, let's ask you about the Smoking Gun memo that Arthur just referred to, that he wrote in 1985. Would you say that that is notice to the administration of the Getty Museum that they, in fact, were engaging in acquisition of stolen property?
Yeah, definitely. That's why we call it the Smoking Gun Memo.
Can you elaborate a little bit about that, if you would?
Well, there were pieces that the Getty bought from Maurice Templesman, who was the very famous boyfriend of Jackie O, and he sold diamonds in New York, a diamond magnate. And he bought a lot of antiquities, and he sold a number of pieces to the Getty, and among them were some of the masterpieces that the Getty bought, a marble table stand showing griffins tearing at a doe, a fallen doe, tearing it up. Then you have a statue of Apollo. And so there was some question about, were these made by the same school, same artistic school, where did they come from? And Arthur wrote in his memo that he was able to talk to the dealers, one of them Giacomo Medici, and the other one Robert Heck, where these came from. And in fact, these gentlemen did pinpoint that they came from illegal excavations, although he didn't put that in the memo, but there were recent excavations, recently excavated in the 1970s, the late 1970s, which put it after UNESCO, after the museums were on notice that this was not kosher. And that's where they were found. One was found in an ancient villa, and another one, I can't quite remember right now where it was found. But the concern and the tone of the memo wasn't sort of, oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this? The concern and tone of the memo, quite frankly, was, well, I'm right. It wasn't part of a separate school. It did come from some other area. And it really reflected sort of the attitude at the time. It was a wink-wink attitude. There were no alarm bells that went off that we could see, at least documented anywhere else. It was sort of, this is the way the game is played. And, in fact, at one point, Arthur, I think you might want to talk about this. You did go to a warehouse that Mr. Medici had in Geneva, and where he was the middleman who was running most of the looted antiquities out of northern Italy. And you did see things at his warehouse, and you did talk to him about his process. So these were all open secrets to people who knew about the antiquities market, and they would joke about it at the Getty. They would, they would joke about, for instance, Robert Hecht being quite a character and quite a pirate, and things like that. So this is the attitude that we saw coming out of the documents. It wasn't one of, we're gonna worry about this. However, Jason may want to talk about a key meeting that the Getty had in the 1980s, where they did actually grapple with the ethical issues. It did come to a head. It did come to a point. And that was a pretty dramatic thing that we found, and made it, it was a dramatic turning point in the book. But going into that, everybody kind of knew. It wasn't a secret.
Well, I wanted to ask you, Jason, the people mentioned in this 1985 memo, Robert Hecht, who, by the way, is heir to the Hecht department store chain. And in honor of this panel tonight, I purchased this tie at the old Hecht store downtown, which most of you now know as Macy's. And this fellow Giacomo Medici, both of whom were in the book, continued up until today. In fact, Mr. Hecht was just acquitted the other day.
Not acquitted, but the time expired on his trial.
Okay,
yeah.
Right. Yeah, the case was dismissed. January 19th, I believe, was your story in the LA Times. But, that to me sounds like a continuing conspiracy, beginning, or at least known by the Getty officials in 1985 and continuing through to Marion True. It might even meet the standard for racketeering under federal law. You were speaking last night at Steptoe and Johnson about some of the laws that might apply. Why don't we have any criminal charges in this case?
I think it's a fair question. What became clear through the smoking gun memo, as we call it, or actually as the Getty's own investigators called it when they found it in the files, it was not our invention to call that the smoking gun memo, but it comes out in a lot of the documents that we eventually got our hands on, is that there was clear knowledge by everybody, not just at the Getty, but in this field across the country, that the primary dealers in the trade, Robert Hecht, Giacomo Medici, Robin Symes, Frida Chacos, you name them, were trafficking in stolen property, that they were selling objects that had been recently looted out of the ground in Italy, smuggled out of that country, laundered through Switzerland, and sold to American museums. This was widely known. Robert Hecht had made front-page stories in 1972 in the New York Times for selling the famous Euphroneous crater to the Metropolitan. This was no secret. This is something that was widely known, that these were people who were fences. In fact, some of the records we eventually got describe Robin Symes, another prominent London-based dealer who sold some of the best ancient art in the world, as a fence. And the question that Harold Williams, the CEO of the Getty Trust at the time, a man who was trained as an attorney and who had been running the SEC for Carter before coming to oversee the Getty Trust, his question was, are we willing to buy stolen property for some higher aim? That's the question that American museums wrestled with, and their answer for decades was yes. Why weren't they ever prosecuted in the United States? I think it's a fair question. I think there's a remarkable lack of interest on the part of federal investigators, historically speaking, in investigating these type of crimes. I think a lot of people in the United States see the looting of ancient art as a victimless crime. And what's the harm with having these things on display at our local museums? Isn't that the right outcome? And I think it is incumbent upon us to understand other cultures and their relationships with these objects, which we don't really have this kind of ancient history in our country. So we need to kind of reach beyond our own experience to understand how an Italian may feel connected to a piece of Roman art that Romans have been gone for a long time now.
I'm going to ask Gary to answer. We have a director of a museum. You can come after Gary. We have a director of a museum, and Jason poses an excellent question. Are we willing to buy stolen property for a higher aim? And I want to add on to that question a little bit. So Greece wants the Elgin marbles back. In fact, they're not Elgin's marbles, are they? They're really the Parthenon's marbles, as we heard the other night from the lady, obviously from Greece, who was speaking. Right. Should they give them back? And why are we drawing the line at 1970? Why not 1870?
No, I agree with you. Stolen property is stolen property in the first place. Elgin marbles, I have long believed that the integrity of that monument trumps any story that gets them from where they were to where they are. And that should be revisited. It has been revisited, and I think people got fairly close for a while. All I can tell you is that we are turning a corner that is not clear to any of us at this point. Do I value encyclopedic museums? Yes. Do Italian Americans care about seeing a sarcophagus from Rome at Dumbarton Oaks? Yes, they do. We're a country of immigrants, and encyclopedic museums are places of immigrants. Art immigrants, so to speak. Do we own these things? No. We take care of them. And what is our product? And I think this is really the key. And it came up in your book, this conference in Berlin way back when, in '88 or whenever it was, that if we began to think of museums as places that dealt in experience as distinct from ownership, I think we'd begin to turn a corner in conceptually changing how we understand what this is all about. Does it add value to conserve, authenticate, or disauthenticate, if there is such a word, and analyze works of art that have come from who knows where? Yes. And I just tell the group as a whole, you know, these pieces that the Getty is talking about are truly extraordinary. These are pieces that are, I mean, you know, 1,300 pounds, 7 feet tall, arcolith. This just doesn't happen. The vast majority of material that's traded and has been traded in the last 100 years is little stuff traded for cash in places who knows where. And I think it's important to keep in mind that there's a vast, vast spectrum of significance, quality, price, and no ability. You know, you're never going to find out where that little Jalisco dog came from that sold for $1,500 in 1978. It's just not going to happen. Do you know it came from West Mexico? Yes. It's not there now. So that's where we are.
So Arthur, I know you're egging to respond. Essentially, Jason said that the Getty engaged in knowingly buying recently looted antiquities. You want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, let me just make clear. Gary, who's a dear friend, is a contemporary museum director. I'm here only as a historical source. But as a historical source, I have to take issue with Jason's smoky presumption that somehow the Getty and other museums were engaged in some illicit activity. This is, to use a judicious word, poppycock. By the laws of the state of California, by the laws of the United States government, and by the laws of international laws that governed the trade and purchase and sale of material coming from countries that were not necessarily source countries, but that even today are great markets for art: London, Paris, Zurich, Basel. It was there, and it was not simply fair game, but it was encouraged. It was encouraged by not simply the museums, but by museum boards. by museum boards, and indeed by the community as a whole. We want to see more. We want to see bigger and better museums. We want to see collections that vibrate. But let's go back to the beginning here. You know, in the end, this vast conspiracy that Jason and Ralph, also good friends, described, was not a conspiracy, in fact, of law. It was a conspiracy, perhaps, of design that engaged all of us within the ethical issue of should we acquire this or should we not acquire this, and where most of the decisions came down negative, but not on the issue of provenance, on the issue principally of it's something that the museum should have for the public benefit. Always up there at the top was, is this for the public benefit? Should we be doing this for the right purpose, the right thing? But none of it was illegal at the time, not one thing. And I'll challenge anybody to establish the illegality of anything that was done at that time.
Okay, Ralph, it's up to you to defend the honor of your book and your colleague here. Was it illegal or wasn't it illegal? And let me ask you, just to carry Arthur's point a little bit further for the sake of discussion, since he argues this was not a conspiracy of law, but for the public benefit, the world's richest museum was protecting these artifacts for the public benefit. Well, isn't the Getty Museum better able to protect and preserve these artifacts and these poor people in Sicily?
Well, before I answer that question, maybe somebody in the audience can answer one of my questions, and that is, do you know if there's any legal bilateral treaty with Bangladesh? Because I don't want to be subpoenaed. Anyway, I don't know. I've got to, but no. Let me take the last part first, and that is the Getty better able? The Getty is better able than any other museum, except perhaps the British Museum and the Louvre, with taking care of any piece. It has the money, it has the resources, it has the know-how. No questions asked. The real question is, does the Getty have the right to acquire something and knowingly, or, and here's the trick, knowingly acquire art? And one of Arthur's key memos that we quote at length in the book that sort of establishes the method of operation, it's you don't ask the questions that elicit the answers that you don't want to hear. It's almost like being a good parent sometimes. This is some things you just don't want to know about your kids, okay? And that was the trick. It was a wink and a nod thing that was going on. Was it illegal? Well, we have a 1970 convention agreed to by more than 100 countries now that if a country finds a piece of cultural property that has a historical, artistic, cultural significance to it within its borders, that is the property of that country. And we have a lot of discussion about, well, you know, borders are artificial, and, you know, the people who are there now weren't the people 2,000 years ago, and there are a lot of books out there about that. But that was sort of the bright line that was drawn by the art community through UNESCO. It took the United States until 1983 to accept that, to actually deposit its acceptance with UNESCO. And so, like many legal standards, and this is something we wanted to write about in the book. Now, we're still talking about this in retrospect, but one of the things that just puzzled Jason and I going through this story as a newspaper story, and this is something that journalists grapple with all the time, is it's always retrospective, right? What were you thinking when you were making this decision? And the power of the book is it places you in the stream of time as all these events are happening. And you do see over time that the courts wake up to this. And then they start applying a law to this property, the National Stolen Property Act, that was initially enacted in the 1920s, 1930s to stop the trafficking in stolen cars and to try to catch James Dillinger. The same law is now being applied to looted art. So, yes, it's an evolving standard. To say at any one point in time this was illegal. For instance, the smoking gun memo, technically it was after the 1983 Act and blah, blah, blah. We can get into this. But this is a canard. This is, in my contention, this is my personal opinion, this is a canard because people start looking at their legal technicalities. They're important if you're in court. But it was the attitude we're talking about. It was the attitude where everyone had agreed, the nations had agreed in 1970 that we're going to stop this illicit trade. At the same time, you have some major institutions with a wink and a nod method encouraging the consumption of this property and encouraging the black market.
So,
and the way they papered that over, James, is with policies that looked like they were enlightened. And the Getty was a master at this. The Getty had an acquisition policy that was extremely tough, and before 1986. And it said, we will not acquire anything that's questionable. We will not acquire anything that doesn't have a good provenance, which is actually a pedigree. And because they saw this beautiful statue of the Aphrodite, they decided they had to make a special policy for antiquities. And what they did is they created basically a loophole, saying, well, if we see an antiquity, we'll ask the probable country of origin. Do you know about this? We'll ask the dealer and rely on the dealer's word. And we'll offer it back if anyone comes up with convincing proof. Now, that sounds good, except they also said in these secret discussions that they know the dealers are liars. And it was widely known that countries could not prove something was looted because looted, by the definition of looted, means taken away secretly.
well,
So how is a country going to know?
there is a concept known as willful ignorance, which it sounds like...
Willful blindness, yes.
Exactly, which was applied here. But I wanted to ask Jason about another standard because I heard him talk about it last night. Can you tell us about United States versus McLean? Wouldn't that apply here? Why does that not apply? Why are we talking about 1983 when that case was 1977?
Yeah, good point.
It's a good question. Arthur, I admire his vigorous defense of his position, but I need to remind him of a memo that he wrote to his bosses in 1983. Because Arthur, rather eloquently, he's a very good memo writer. He used to work in the State Department. He'll tell you lots of stories about that afterwards. But he's an excellent memo writer, and he laid out the status of the law in 1983 for his bosses. And what he said is, what we need to do is be very careful of this pesky little law called the National Stolen Property Act. Because based on this 1977 decision, McLean, if you knowingly buy something that was looted from a foreign country, that's not just a violation of that foreign country's laws. Under U.S. law, that is recognized as stolen property in the U.S., and therefore you're violating American law. And that precedent, which was begun in 1977, has been recognized twice now in the courts, and it was the ruling precedent at the time when the Getty was buying these objects. The policy that Arthur developed at the Getty was referred to by him, and this is my favorite turn of phrase of yours in many eloquent turns of phrase, was called optical due diligence. Let's look like we're doing our due diligence, but let's buy what we want. I think it's very clear that the McLean decision today is in act. McLean and the National Stolen Property Act, interestingly, was modified in 1987, I believe. And the modification said, it's not just a violation of the law to have purchased stolen property. It's a violation of the law to continue to possess stolen property. And the implications of that are profound for American museums, because any museum in America that has in its possession a looted antiquity is in current violation of U.S. federal law and could be criminally liable up to the Board of Trustees. This was recently expounded upon in a law review article that came out last year. This is the law of the land, and to ignore it is, as a friend of Arthur's recently found out, is done at your peril, because you can be arrested by federal authorities. The fact that this law has not been vigorously enforced is changing, and I think federal authorities, in particular Immigrations and Customs Enforcement and the FBI, have taken a renewed interest in this area of the law and understand that a U.S. attorney looking to make a career for himself could make quite a case.
So I wanted to ask Gary, I've been, I think, to most of the 18 museums in the Smithsonian, maybe all of them, having covered it. Although I haven't been to the Walters, I plan to go soon. I assume that if I go to the Walters and I see items on display, that the provenance will be immediately transparent. There will not be any that say a gift of an anonymous donor. Is that correct?
James, you're lucky. You don't even have to come to the Walters. Our website has everything on it.
And which I knew, and I had heard that. We talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
That's true for every museum in the United States, isn't it?
Oh, no, I don't think so.
I didn't think so, yeah. Can you talk about that a little bit? What are the standards?
Well, I mean, the standards, the general overarching principle of transparency, due diligence, and good faith engagement, which govern what we do in accepting things of this sort, are sort of in the background of the 2008 revisit of the ethical code, which has 1970 as a call to good behavior, I would say. And we use them, and that's what guides us really in putting everything on the internet. So everything we know is out there, and we strive to know as much as we can. But I guess it comes back to many things that we have are at a level of value and historical significance for which nothing shall ever be known beyond what we know right now.
Arthur, I'd like to ask you, so I go to a museum, the provenance is not transparent. We're not at the Walters, we're at another museum. It's a gift of an anonymous donor, and it's a Greek or Roman antiquity, and we're in Cleveland. Can't I assume that it was looted?
No, of course not. No, there are a lot of material that's in museums that they've acquired over the past 30, 40, 50 years have in fact come legitimately from private collections that have been in existence for some period of time, both in the United States and outside. I'd like to broaden this discussion a little bit because I think we're too narrow on this issue of what's on a label in a museum. I think a question really that needs to be engaged is the degree to which we as Americans want to find ourselves subject to foreign law in terms of what we do, how we behave. And even though we recognize that the state of Italy is an extraordinary place with enormous riches and the right to have its own objects back to the extent that it knows exactly which ones they are, I have to ask you whether we realize, whether we really want to have the application of Italian law to the United States. The 1939 law of Italy makes it illegal to export photographs more than 25 years old. Think about it for a second. I mean, you can go to the ridiculous extent of that one, but talk about other countries farther afield than Italy, somewhere in the Middle East or Africa, further into Asia. Are there laws now to apply to us and our behavior? Give me a break. I mean, seriously, Jason, this is outrageous. So, I mean, how can you answer that problem?
Arthur is outraged, Ralph. I'm sure you could hear that even in Bangladesh. So I'd like you to talk a little bit. He's outraged that Marion True has been charged in the country of Italy. She's not accused of killing her boyfriend. That's a different case.
Yeah.
In this case, she's accused of what? And by the way, why don't we tell a little bit about Mrs. True's conflicts of interest? What did she receive from one of the alleged fences for these stolen properties?
Well, when she became a curator in 1986, pretty much plucked from obscurity, but very, very capable person. One of the first trips she took was a tour of Europe to look for antiquities. And at the time, the Getty had acquired a Kuros that the museum claimed was authentic, and then questions were starting to be raised about whether it was authentic or just a hodgepodge put together by forgers. And so there was a little embarrassment there, and they needed a piece to really bolster the reputation of the Getty. And she came across this acrolith. An acrolith is a combination piece. It's a body is made of stone, traditionally marble, I mean not marble, but local stone, and the extremities, the hands, the feet, the head is usually made of marble. And these acroliths were made by Greek communities that did not have access to marble, so they would cover the body or paint the body and then use imported marble for the rest. And she saw this statue of a Greek goddess in a warehouse in London, and it was striking. It was gorgeous, and it was authentic. And she said, this will put the Getty on the map. And she wanted that piece. And it was being sold by a dealer named Robin Symes, who Jason had mentioned earlier, was pretty much a dealer to the wealthy. And he eventually sold this statue to Marion True, to the Getty, and Marion True recommended the sale, of course. And it was a blockbuster piece, $18 million. And they didn't announce it at the time, but everybody knew it was quite expensive. And immediately there were charges that this thing was looted. In fact, the day that the deal was signed, where Harold Williams signed the deal to finally buy the piece, the Getty received a telegram from Italy saying this is under investigation. So this becomes a motif of the book. That's why we call it Chasing Aphrodite, because Marion says this is such a beautiful piece. It must be the goddess of love, Aphrodite. Over time, what happens is that the Italians go to Giacomo Medici's warehouse, and they raid the warehouse, and they find a trove of Polaroids, of before and after photos of these great antiquities that are in American museums. They see these antiquities as they are pulled out of the ground, dirty, broken, and whatnot, sort of the before photos to the museum glamour shots you see in the catalogs. And they build a case, and they also get correspondence between Marion True and Giacomo Medici, in which they discuss things that are clearly looted. So she gets pulled into a case. Giacomo Medici is charged, and she gets pulled into case as a conspirator. And this becomes a huge thing in the art world. This was the 2005 indictment that sort of the story got ahead of us as we were reporting on it. But what we found out in our reporting is that Marion True also got a loan from Robin Symes's, arranged through Robin Symes's lover and partner at the time.
Tell us who Symes is, please.
Robin Symes is a London dealer who sold antiquities to the top museums, but mostly to the Getty and to rich people around the world. He was he was like the Mercedes-Benz dealer of antiquities. And so what we found out that is when you're talking about conflict of interest, that Marion True wanted to buy a vacation home in Paros, in the Greek island of Paros. And so she ended up getting a loan arranged through and, according to one very good source, originated from Robin Symes' dealer partner. So here she recommends a purchase, $18 million for this statue. And a few years later, she gets a loan, personal loan, that she does not declare and does not tell her bosses about. Then she rolls that loan over after recommending a purchase, the second biggest purchase ever in Getty history for antiquities from private collectors in New York who happen to be her friends. And the day after it's announced, or a couple days after, just immediately, she gets another loan to take out the first loan. Again, not disclosed to her bosses and not disclosed to anyone. And we're talking $400,000 loans. And so actually that's what got Marion True fired. When we pursued that story and outed that story from the Getty, they fired her over that ethical breach. And in fact, it robbed her of a lot of support within the museum community because she was seen as a leader, a leading reformer. But the Italians saw her as a conspirator. Okay? And so this is, go ahead.
I was going to turn to Gary and ask Gary, was Marion True a conspirator?
Actually, I'm going to shift this slightly because she's not here to defend herself, and I am uncomfortable with this. And it's all in the book, and you can form your own opinions about that. I'd like to get above the weeds a little bit and put a proposition forward that's general, but springs from this book, and that is that the movement of art is like the movement of ideas, but for it to move, it has to move both ways. And this conversation is predicated on this notion somehow that museums are in violation of things and everything is kind of polluted. But at the same time, for this to work, for us to go forward, for us to get to a different place, it's essential that the art supply countries and the art poor countries be in a conversation that's bilateral. And so Italian museums are chock-a-block with things in basements. How to get that stuff to move, how to get it here, how to get it to places where people would love to see it, and let it go back after a while. We don't need to own it. But for this to turn a corner, we can't do it by ourselves. I applaud the book. I think it's wonderful that you've laid bare something that's painful, that's very sad. I read it a second time. It's just a sad story. But where do we go from here?
Well, I'd like to take Gary's advice and elevate the conversation by inviting your questions. I think it's probably time to take some questions, and I'm just certain there's 2 microphones. Carrie's going to tell us about that.
There's 2 microphones on either side of the room. If you will remember, please state your name, your affiliation. Keep your questions short and no statements. Otherwise, there are hooks. So to start, why don't we start on this side of the room?
Derek Liebart, business person. The book asserts that U.S. collecting museums and collectors are primarily responsible for looting in source countries. Now, Mr. Houghton, you've told us you were at the Getty for these pivotal years. What do you have to say about that?
Well, look, this is a good book. I totally agree with Gary, and this is a wonderful book in terms of the description of a period of existence that no longer is there. It gets a little preachy toward the end, and it does suggest that somehow American collecting museums and collectors are substantially responsible for the flow of antiquities out of source countries and the destruction as a result of that of what we all want, which is the preservation of sites, the sites of ancient culture. And that's just wrong. I would say to quantify it, it's very difficult to quantify it. It is true that collections do intensify the search for collectibles, no question about that. But the real problem abroad has little to do with collections in the United States or Europe. It has to do with the bulldozer. It has to do with the development policies of source countries that allow the destruction of sites with little consequence. It allows the enforcement policies and of source countries that allows local citizens of those countries to collect at will, have an open market of their own, buy from the contractors who've dug up the roads, planted the villas, created new townships, and have destroyed the historical past. The consequence is huge and enormous and ongoing and every day. And by comparison, what has gone on in this country is about that small. It's a thimbleful. Thank you for the question. I'm glad you asked it.
We'll go to this side of the room.
Dan Perella, just to follow on that, one of the issues that we look at is the countries that would much rather destroy than even allow these antiquities to be sold. Countries that their laws say they would rather destroy a possible graven image than allow it to be acquired by anyone outside of their nationality.
Do you have a question?
So how do we balance, these, when you have less than reputable people and they're the only ones that are allowing that to be brought out of those nations? How does a museum or a collections here balance that prospect?
Who are you referring to?
We've seen a lot coming out of Afghanistan and a lot of the basically embattled areas of the world now, where there's a lot of less than reputable dealers and a lot of local townspeople who would much rather sell for $100 than make a little bit for their family, whereas shortly thereafter the local populace can destroy those images.
I can take a stab at it. I mean, I think the question raises a good point. When we talk about the problem of looting, looting happens in the source countries by people who live in those source countries. It is a criminal offense in the local country. Why are people looting archaeological sites? My guess, and having spoken to a number of looters, their motive is not because they love art. It's not because they're, some of them fall in love with art in the process, but oftentimes they're trying to feed their families. And Gary made a comparison to the flow of ideas and the flow of art. I would compare the flow of ancient art with the flow of drugs. You have source countries where that responds to demand in the market. And as long as we've been fighting the drug war, we've been unable to eradicate coca crops throughout Latin America because there's incredible demand for cocaine in the United States. Are we responsible for that? Yes. Are we the only people who are participating in this? No. There's a whole criminal network supplying us. And I think that's an adequate parallel for what's going on in the illicit antiquities trade. You have a criminal network organized around securing the vast dollars that are present in this country and far beyond this country in acquiring these objects. Since the scandals that we write about in the book and the impressive changes that you've seen in the American Museum community and the fact that collectors can no longer freely donate looted objects to American museums, that demand has shifted to other countries. Not completely, but particularly in the Greek and Roman area. You still see aggressive acquisition of pre-Columbian material, Southeast Asian material, Near Eastern material in the United States through very similar smuggling networks that has not received the same scrutiny that the classical antiquities have. That's an ongoing problem, and we need to accept that we play a role in that. When we build new wings for Near East art, we are creating a demand, and the market will supply that demand.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, just I think building on what that gentleman just said, the classic example, at least for me, is the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were destroyed by the Taliban in, when was that, 2001 maybe, spring of 2001. When Iraq, when Baghdad fell, and there was the looting of the museum and the burning of the library, in some respects we lamented the loss to Iraq of their national patrimony. But that's a cradle of civilization, which means to say it's our cradle too. And so we have an interest, a global interest, and I think that should be acknowledged in this conversation.
My name is Bob Kelly, and like Arthur, I'm a former Foreign Service officer and now a Washington attorney. And I want maybe the question is to the investigative journalists. Have you ever considered, or is it the case, that the Italians looted Libya right down to the bone during the Italian occupation? So is there a little bit of hypocrisy here on the part of the Italians when they steal from one country and come to us for return of the art?
Well, I think that Jason and Ralph point this out actually in the very beginning of their book, the very point you're making. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I think it's a very fair point. I mean, Italy is not a poor country. Italy was until recently the 6th largest economy in the world, and used to be a colonial power. As a colonial power, it behaved much like the British, much like the United States did. It took home a lot of the objects in the countries that it had colonized. In Italy's case, Libya was a colony, and Italy has confronted, to some extent, this hypocrisy, which I think is fair to call it hypocrisy, by making perhaps a token attempt to return some very important Libyan antiquities in its possession to Libya, now that the regime in Libya has changed and there's more confidence in the regime. I don't think that completely resolves the issue, but I think it's a fair point. I should note that I think there's an important difference between modern looting and colonial collection building. Those colonial practices have been going on for centuries, and we know well about them. What sets apart the issues that we write about in our book are that there is a legal regime that developed domestic American law and international treaties intent on stopping the looting of antiquities all around the globe. That really began symbolically with 1970, has continued. That is a different issue in my mind than these colonial issues, including the Elgin marbles, which should be judged on their merits, that are moral issues, but which don't often have a legal regime through which we can see them. Modern looting and the active participation of American museums in creating a demand for that, I think is a different issue.
Ralph, do you want to add anything? We lost Ralph. Next question.
Okay.
Next question.
My name is Louisa Woodville, and I'm a medieval art historian at George Mason. And my question is, how does what you are talking about with these antiquities, does it pertain to manuscripts too? I'm thinking of the recent Gospel of Judas, and it had this wild provenance, I guess you would call it, where it was frozen and then it was aired out and this and that. But would this also pertain to valuable manuscripts?
She's asking about manuscripts.
I can
Gary?
add to that. Yes, it would. It wouldn't be any different. I'll give one example, though, of how ambiguous things can be. So we had an exhibition of a palimpsest that carries some important source work for Archimedes, and this show just closed in early June. And the book doesn't belong to us. It was bought by a private collector, and the private collector was challenged legally right before the sale at Christie's in late October of 1998 by the Greek government, saying that this object, which sold for $2 million the next day, had been stolen from a monastery in Constantinople, then Constantinople. No question this thing was in that monastery. It was seen in that monastery. No question that sometime between, let's say, 1912 and 1919, it ends up in Paris. How it got to Paris is not at all clear. Did one of the monastics sell the work? It's not impossible. Did he give it away? It's possible. So because the Greek government and no one else could demonstrate that it was in fact stolen and not sold or given away, there was no basis for enjoining the sale. And I think that's very important because it applies to a whole lot of this stuff.
Well, in the work that the Walters done, I got an opportunity to see this when we were at the Walters in October. The work that the Walters has done in gathering together a group of scientists to study this, to do incredible research on it, really speaks to the value that museums can provide to these objects. I don't know anywhere else in the world where that kind of scientific rigor could have been brought to studying a very important ancient text and kind of bringing it to new light. So we shouldn't overlook the incredible good that museums do, and that's a very good example of them.
But aren't you justifying an acquisition then?
I don't think that that justifies breaking American law or encouraging the pillage of archaeological sites, which ultimately, if museums' mission is to promote education, the pillage of archaeological sites, looting, destroys information. It is the ultimate destroyer of the archaeological record. It separates us from the history of these objects and the meaning of these objects and renders them mute. So no, I don't think I think there is a distinction between documents and objects like Greek vases, and I think the actual academics make this distinction that documents carry a certain amount of information with them as they go wherever they travel. Greek vases don't always carry that same information, and statues don't always carry that same kind of information. And so if you look at the policies of the organizations, the academic organizations that handle documents, they have different rules around collecting than for example, archaeologists.
Perfect.
Of course, I'm a private citizen and just sometime collector. And the question I have is kind of, maybe it's complicated in a way, but I'll try to simplify it. For private individual, a lot of what you're talking about is impossible to investigate a provenance, and you're at a coin show in New York, and there's literally no way, even if you feel compelled to act morally. The other part of it is a lot of these cultural antiquities are, as Ralph referred to, not really connected to the country which, under the present regime, quote unquote, owns them. Ephesus is in Turkey. Syracuse is in Sicily, when the highest application of their arts, especially in minting,
were under the Greeks, and there are many, many, many all over the world, Asia.
So is there a
Europe.
question?
Yes. So the question is, what's wrong with finders, keepers, losers, weepers?
Yeah, I like that. What's wrong with finders, keepers, losers, reapers? And he made specific reference to, like,
Coin
how do you
collectors.
know the provenance of a coin in a New York coin show?
Let me be the first to tell you the rules have changed. They've changed dramatically and significantly and in a manner which I'm perfectly comfortable with. It was finders, keepers in the international market when I was in the Antiquities Department of the Getty Museum. It is no longer the case today. One has to be not only cautious, but rightfully so. In the end, the sensitivity involved is much greater and much deeper than it was before, and that's a good thing. We evolve as a society, and we're evolving in this area. I would add that some of the questions that Gary has posed, which is the degree to which we resolve these very thorny issues, of which all of us have been either observers or participants in, is really a major concern. How do we make this better? What is the point of this all? What are we trying to do? And I'd propose that we were really trying to do our best to save our own historical past by ensuring that the antiquity sites are not plundered, and by ensuring that the objects themselves that may be out of those sites, not returnable and with unknown provenance, are taken care of in a manner where the museums and the public have some benefit from them, substantial benefit. But we need to work our way through that. We're not there yet.
We have a question.
My name is Ellen Herscher. I'm a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. My question is for Jason, who mentioned at the beginning that he got involved with the Getty story because he was looking into the tax issues in regard to Munitz. And I'd like to hear what he thinks about the broader tax issues in regard to the antiquities scandal. It is a nonprofit institution. The Fleischmann collection, when it was donated, got a big tax write-off.
Yeah.
And in the end, so many antiquities, what, $500 million,
He'll answer.
were given back to.
Right,
yeah.
right. It's a great question. The American art market at large is estimated to be worth about $50 billion a year. It is almost completely unregulated. And I think some of what I've concluded from reporting on the Getty and other American museums is that a huge market like that goes virtually unregulated will have anomalies pop up. You're going to have cheating. And we've seen problems museums encounter. Museums are vested with a really remarkable authority. They have the ability to give donors of ancient art tax write-offs. Those objects that are being donated, the valuation process for those objects is often obscure and often influenced by the museum receiving the donation. And so that's tax fraud, and that's a violation of the tax code. The Getty, when it was being asked to return antiquities, screamed and cried that it couldn't do so, because if it did so, the Attorney General, who's the nominal regulator of nonprofits in each state, would remove its nonprofit status. Well, after our stories came out, the Attorney General said that it was going to take a look at whether the Getty had violated its nonprofit status by A, buying stolen property, and B, being forced to give back what are essentially public assets, assets that are tax-exempt, huge resources. I mean, the Getty's endowment is a $6 billion endowment. That's tax-exempt. They don't pay taxes on the art they buy in California or federally because we've granted them this special status, because they play a special role in society. When they violate that role, they could potentially lose that tax-exempt status. We haven't seen that happen. I think the interest that attorney generals have taken in museums has been not very significant. But it's something I think that's worthy of thinking of. I think you see tax code problems crop up at museums historically, and they keep recurring.
I would make a point that I think although there's been some disagreement on this panel, I believe that, Arthur, that there was agreement on Mr. Frell at the Getty when we talked earlier.
It was, but this is a small point. I mean, if you want to go into Frell, we're down into the weeds. Very briefly, Frell was my curator when I arrived, and Frell was engaged in several types of operations involving not only theft from the museum, but criminal conspiracy. I could go through that, but, you know, is this the issue that we want to talk about? Jason's point is perfectly good, I think, which is that the art market in the United States, indeed in the world, is the largest unregulated industry in existence. In the United States, is overwhelmingly dominated by contemporary art. That's what people produce, that's where it's marketed, that's what's sold. It's the dealers who establish what the prices are for the most part, and are the intermediaries between the producing artist and the whatever the market is, that is whoever buys them. Antiquities is really tiny by comparison. You could go down the line of this kind of thing, but the question is this an industry that really wants to bring itself into compliance with standard rules of industrial transparency? I don't think so. Think about it. The dealers don't want it. The buyers don't want it. It's a market that's happy to be cheated, allow itself to be hoodwinked in many ways, which it is. There's a lot of bad stuff that goes on to the market across the board, but the market will not reform itself, and I rather doubt that anybody can bring that kind of clout to change the rules, at least over the near term, as far as I can see it.
The reason I think the Frell case is important is that I'm not convinced it's not still going on today at other museums.
It won't. Let me demonstrate. Can I take a moment here? This is really interesting. I'd like to name 5 of you as conspirators. I'm going to take one of you over here and say, I am a curator at the X museum, but let's say it was the Getty. I want to buy your Roman head. How much is the Roman head? You say $50,000. I'll say no. We won't pay $50,000. We'll pay $100,000. I'll get my museum to cut you a check for $100,000, and it does. But your head goes in the museum, invoiced at $100,000. You and I know we have a deal at 50. That gives me 50 under my control in your hands. I just stole that from the museum. Over here, I mean, you're smiling at me, so I'll make you a co-conspirator. You are the next dealer I see, and you have some objects that I know my board, which I consider to be vile and stupid, will not buy. Therefore, I have to find a way to get it into the museum. I want that material in your hand in the museum. It may not be very expensive. It's $20,000. So what I do is say, I'll buy it. $20,000 comes from my friend over here over to you. It then goes to a dealer that's somewhere out here, another co-conspirator, if I can find one.
Lady in the pink.
No, Jim, I want you to be the co-conspirator dealer in the front row, which then takes it in, that $20,000 object, finds a donor. Someone out there wants to be a donor, I'll find you. In any case, the donor then agrees to buy this material for some amount of money, but then I then arrange to have the $20,000 object written up as a $100,000 object in my own office using the skills of my own secretary. That's fraud, and that's conspiracy, and that's big-time federal fraud, as you know. So we've got 4 people here. I've missed the 5th. The 5th is the person who gave me the appraisal forms to write this all out on.
The guy in the back.
That's right, the guy in the back. Okay, fine. That was the mechanism. I don't believe for an instant this goes on in other museums. First of all, Frell was had operated according to the standard rules of procedure in a communist country that he had lived in.
Very quickly, let me just say, the federal government believes this is still going on today. In January of 2008, more than 100 federal agents raided 4 Southern California museums. They were investigating a smuggling network that was allegedly perpetrating the exact tax fraud that Arthur described with the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, the Pacific Asian Museum of Art, and several other Southern California museums. These were Southeast Asian antiquities smuggled into the United States, furnished with kited appraisals that elevated the value, and donated to these museums, which got free looted antiquities, and in exchange, the donors got inflated tax write-offs. There's been nobody indicted yet in that case, but but there's ample evidence from the 5-year undercover operation with wiretaps and hidden button cameras that this has been going on in American museums and continues to go on.
Well, I'm corrected on this, and Southern California has many problems. This may be one of them.
We have a few more questions. If you could ask your question just really quickly so that everyone is included, and then we'll wrap this up. If you'd like to ask a quick question.
I'm Emily Alonzo. I'm a student at Georgetown Law, so I have a hypothetical question for you. So suppose a museum in the U.S. buys the antiquity in good faith, and they recently learned that it was recently looted, and the country where it was looted from wants it back. But the museum knows that once it returns, it will be destroyed through poor curation care or whatever. So what ethically and legally should the museum do?
To whom was that addressed?
Who would you like that answered
I'd
by?
say the museum
anyone.
director.
Okay. No, I'm very comfortable taking that. I don't think it's our business to second guess what happens when it goes back. If we know it's looted and where it came from and a request is made to return it, we can talk up, down, and sideways about climate control in the museums in Italy, or whether or not the Chinese are building dams to screw up something, or the Syrians have done the same thing with their mosaics. In a way, that's their problem, and I can't get into that.
We have a question over on the side.
Yes, I have a question. In the last, I'd say 10 years, there's been a deluge of work coming in from China. A lot of it is antiquities from graves. Several weeks ago, there was a major article in the New York Times about, in quotes, the hot items to collect is Chinese antiquities. This is to anyone. How are people beginning to address this influx of Chinese? A lot of it is Chinese jades from the Neolithic, the Zhou era, and also the bronzes. Are people beginning to pay attention to this?
Thank you.
Well, the implementation legislation of the UNESCO Convention of 1970 that was passed by the United States in 1983 provides a mechanism to address that issue. And in fact, I believe, I was on that cultural property committee that deliberated on behalf of the State Department on that. And I believe it's true that China and the United States have a bilateral agreement, which in effect gives the United States the obligation to take on as our import rules what are the export rules of China. So whether this is working or not, I have no idea.
There's often a big gap between the kind of policy and the practice, and I have heard often that China's the new classical, and that people are gobbling up this material. Museums are gobbling up this material as fast as they can, and so I think it's a significant area of concern, and one that when you go to your local museum and you see Chinese antiquities on display, you should feel empowered as a taxpayer to ask the museum, how did you get this? Where did it come from? How did it enter the country? That's our right to ask our local museums.
The lady in the pink sweater, and then the last two questions with the next two people.
Hi, I'm Analia Burstein-Simpson. I'm a junior at Dartmouth College, and I was wondering, we talked a lot about 1970 as a landmark decision, a convention. How has the U.S. government enforced it, and how has the United States, say, attitude towards UNESCO maybe influenced its enforcement?
Who wants to answer that?
Who did you want?
Well, I would say probably you and then Gary.
I didn't hear the first part of the question. I apologize.
I was wondering how the 1970 convention was enforced, or how it is enforced.
Well, actually, I can speak to that
Please.
if you want. And I alluded to it briefly in the Chinese question a moment ago, but the United States passed implementation legislation in 1983, and we were the first art importing country of significance to do that. We were way ahead of the game. And the legislation is given expression through a committee that has 11 members from various constituencies and interests. And they review a request from a foreign country and analyze it by a series of criteria, among other, is the country trying to stop the looting? If we enter into this relationship, will it in fact do some good? Or will all the trade go to Brussels or London or some such? And the last one is, if we were to do this for this country, what will they do for us in order to facilitate the movement of art objects, much as ideas might cross borders? So this has been running now for, 20 years? 30 years almost. And I'm not sure if it works. I don't know. There's a lot of toing and froing, as there is in any kind of political process, which is basically what this is.
Maybe I can add to that for a minute. I was on the first 4 years of the Cultural Property Committee, and there's been an increasing feeling that somehow the mechanism itself is defective. It's not working quite right. The reason is not that the United States doesn't enter into agreements with foreign countries, but the reciprocity elements are not very strong. And what comes back to the United States as a result of that agreement is relatively small in comparison to what the United States offers and then provides. Beyond that, there's another issue, which is that the trigger mechanism includes compliance by other countries. That is, the degree to which the question is the degree to which other countries are significant markets and the degree to which they themselves have acted to restrict their own markets. And that is really weak. I mean, it's one of the weakest parts of this particular mechanism that appears increasingly to be one-sided in the favor of other countries, even as they ask things of us that they themselves don't choose not to respond to.
And one of our last questions?
Yes, excuse me. I'm going to refer to your initial comments about Larry Small and the Smithsonian and that collection of feather art that was purchased by him. And my question is really, what happened at the end of that? Because the understanding that I had about that collection was that about 2% of that collection really had endangered species elements in it. And my perspective on that is that, well, you shouldn't really trash this collection because, as I understand the type of art that it was, much of it was done by tribes that, as they came in contact with the outside, lost those traditions. And so that's actually my
Yeah,
question.
I don't know that. I know of nothing that was done to it. I think he may own it, but I'm not sure. I don't know if it was seized by the federal government. And in fact, that case happened before we began the investigation into his spending. You know, he's the first Smithsonian secretary in the 180-year history of the Smithsonian to be convicted of a crime, and was allowed by the Board of Trustees for the Smithsonian to remain in office, which was quite shocking. And in fact, the tipsters, of course, for the people who dropped the dime on him, the story was he had this collection, he was very proud of it, and he had this little museum, this little private gallery that he had set up. And he invited the Washington Post interior design writer to come do a feature story on it, which they did with photos. And some ornithologists in the Natural History Museum noted that they were endangered species, which launched a federal investigation, and he was later convicted. And a secret investigation no one knew about, and it was only announced after they pled out. But what happened to the collection, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that it would necessarily have returned to the country of origin, and I don't remember it being seized, but it might have been because it was illegally imported into the United States, so it may have been taken by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
And our last question?
Megan Mulcairn, MA in Museum Studies. I'm wondering, there's a lot of finger pointing between, you know, which museums have done the wrong thing, who gets to own what. But do you think it's really more about who has the right to own the beautiful things because, you know, we live in a certain location, or really about protecting that archaeological context? Because I haven't heard a lot about really the archaeological context tonight.
Archaeological context.
I mean, I think the question gets to the issue of what's the cost of looting. What's the problem with looting? Why not bring these things to America and take care of them and put them on display? And the cost of looting is the destruction of the archaeological context, which is our primary source of information about ourselves, our ancient selves, how we got here, the ancient world. And so when you remove an archaeological object from its context, you have this beautiful vase that can go on display at the museum, but what you've lost is the kind of connection to all the things around it in that archaeological site that might help you understand what it meant to the people who made it and why they might have made it and infused it with such creativity. The happy note that we touch on at the end of the book, in the final chapter is called Beyond Ownership, and I think Gary was getting at this earlier, is that there is very thankfully, I mean, this argument that we're echoing here tonight has been going on at least since Cicero, right? At least since Roman times. Finally, we have a little glimpse of a way forward, and Gary alluded to it. It is both museums and source countries beginning to understand that these objects do have a universal value to all of us, and that if we can get beyond our old school notions of ownership and possession and property rights and understand these things as a shared trust, we can find ways to share these things because there's plenty of archaeological material to go around in the world. What's needed is a legal regime by which we can share them. Well, that legal regime has begun to emerge just in the last 3 or 4 years. Gary's spoken about it eloquently, and it's a system of loans and cultural property agreements between source countries and museums, with the understanding that if we work together, the resources of American museums and the conservation expertise and all of the things that American museums bring can benefit the source countries. And their objects can come here and stay for a few years, up to 8 years now in the case of Italy, and be conserved and protected and then sent back home. And then you get a new object from the basement of the National Museum in Rome, something that's never left Rome before. The best example of this, ironically perhaps, is the Getty Museum, which is really forging ahead aggressively. It kind of took the worst heat in this scandal, but it has really embraced this notion of moving beyond ownership to a system of loans, and it's a pioneering move. It's by no means game over, but I think if we're looking for a way to move forward where we can all appreciate this art without fostering looting, this is the direction to move in.
I'd add one thing only, that we show 15% of our art. So we have a lot in our basement that we would be happy to share with somebody.
I think this is a fabulous way to close this evening. Thank you so much for coming.
Well,
books are on sale in the back. Thank you, Jason. Thank you, James and Arthur and Gary. And Ralph sent a text message apologizing for the phone disconnection. So thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you.
Long time no see.